Hey, what's up, guys, and welcome back. And today I'm back with a new movie. What if Naruto went missing for 10 years and returned as the leader of a nation? Who are those people? What are they capable of? What is Naruto Uzumaki capable of to lead such special people? And what does he truly desire? Well, if you want to find out, place your feet up, sit back, relax, and enjoy, guys.
10 years. That was how long it had been since Naruto Uzumaki disappeared from the face of the earth, and in those 10 years, the world had not waited for him. It had bled, fractured, grieved, and kept moving the way the world always does when it loses something it cannot replace. It started at the Valley of the End. That was where they found nothing. No bodies, no blood trail, no chakra residue worth following. Just the two great stone giants staring at each other across still water, and an absence so complete it felt like the valley itself had swallowed them whole. Naruto Uzumaki and Sasuke Uchiha had gone to that place to settle something between them, and whatever they settled it in silence, because neither of them ever came home. Jiraiya searched first. The old Sannin tore through every shadow network he had ever built, called in every dead owed to him from Rain Country to the far edges of the map, and came back with nothing. He sat with Tsunade for a long time after his last lead dried up, and neither of them said much. There was not much to say. Jiraiya had found Naruto once before when the world had buried him in obscurity. This time, the world had nothing to give back. Tsunade tried next. She deployed sensor teams, had Enbu burn months chasing chocolate signatures that turned cold before they could be traced, and when even her most trusted tracker returned empty-handed, she did something she had not done in years. She sat alone in her office after everyone had gone home, and she let herself grieve like a grandmother, not a Hokage. The village mourned differently. Konoha had never quite known what to make of Naruto Uzumaki when he was alive. He was too loud, too stubborn, too much, and most of them had spent the better part of his childhood looking through him rather than at him. But absence has a way of clarifying things, and in the years after the Valley of the End, Konoha began to understand, slowly and painfully, exactly what it had been looking through. The orange jumpsuit became something people remembered fondly. His name became something people said quietly, with weight. Sakura Haruno stopped sleeping well somewhere in the first year. She threw herself into medical work the way she always did when she did not want to think, until her hands were steadier than almost anyone alive and her eyes carried something older than her age. She told herself she was fine. She told herself this so many times it almost became true. Hinata Hyuga mourned in a way no one fully saw. She had loved Naruto with the kind of quiet, absolute devotion that asks nothing in return, and losing him felt like losing a direction. Like a compass needle that had nothing left to point toward. She kept training, she kept breathing, but something in her had gone still. Kiba said he was fine and meant it less every time. Shikamaru analyzed the situation the way he analyzed everything, breaking grief down into its components as if understanding it thoroughly enough might make it smaller, and it never did. Team 7, as a concept, ceased to exist. Kakashi carried what was left of it like a scar, and the world, indifferent to all of this, kept getting worse. The Akatsuki were no longer a shadow organization moving quietly through the underworld. They were a declaration, a statement written in missing villages and broken treaties, and the statement said, plainly, that the age of the hidden nations was ending. One by one, the tailed beasts had been hunted down and torn from their Jinchuriki, and the Akatsuki collected them the way a man collects debts, methodically, inevitably, without particular hurry. Shukaku, Matabi, Isobu, Chome, Kakuo, Seiken, Gyuki, 7 tails taken, and then the 8th. The 8 tails was supposed to be different. Killer B was not a man who could simply be overwhelmed, and the Raikage, his brother, had made it publicly known that any attempt on Kumogakure's Jinchuriki would be answered with the full weight of the cloud. But the Akatsuki had not become what they were by being deterred by certainty. When word of the 8 tails reached the Raikage, he did something no Kage had done in a generation. He called for a summit, not a negotiation, not a diplomatic overture, but a war council, and he did not dress it up as anything else. The hidden nations answered because they had no choice. The Akatsuki now held 8 of the 9-tailed beasts, and the mathematics of that fact made every border dispute, every old grudge, every generational wound between the villages feel exactly as small as it was. Tsunade came, Gaara came, the 5th case Kage and the Jinchuriki who had lived through having his own beast taken from him, carrying that hollow space inside him with the composure of someone who had decided that surviving was itself a form of defiance. The Mizukage, the Tsuchikage, they all came, and they sat in the same room together without declaring war on each other, which was itself a kind of miracle. 8 beasts. The Akatsuki had 8 beasts. The ninth, the 9 tails, the most powerful of them all, had been sealed inside Naruto Uzumaki, who was dead. Or at least, that was what everyone had come to believe, because the alternative, that the 9 tails was still out there sealed inside a boy who had simply vanished, was a question none of them could afford to sit with for long. The beast had not resurfaced. No catastrophic chakra signature had been detected anywhere in the elemental nations in 10 years. The logical conclusion was that Naruto was gone, and the 9 tails was sealed in whatever afterlife had received him. But logic had never been particularly kind to the elemental nations, and the Akatsuki had not stopped looking. The alliance that formed from that summit was imperfect in the way that all alliances between proud nations are imperfect. There were still old grudges wearing the face of cooperation, still Cage who would have preferred to be the one sitting at the head of the table rather than around it. But they worked together because the world had cornered them into it, and that working together produced results. Sasori of the Red Sand was dead. Deidara was dead, taken out in a crater that the land of Earth would carry for decades. Hidan and Kakuzu, the immortal and the miser, had been dealt with in ways that made even hardened shinobi speak quietly about what Shikamaru Nara had become in 10 years of loss. The Akatsuki still breathed, though. They still moved. Pain was alive, and pain was something that could not simply be overwhelmed by numbers or sealed away in a crater. He was a philosophy with a body count, and the Alliance had not yet found an answer to him that held. And behind pain, still wearing the shape of shadow, was something worse, a figure that appeared in mission reports and battlefield accounts with enough consistency to confirm it was real but without enough detail to confirm anything else. A masked man, a presence that had guided the Akatsuki longer than anyone knew, that pulled strings from a position so far behind the curtain that even the organization's own members did not fully understand what they served. Kisame Hoshigaki was still alive and still hunting. Itachi Uchiha was dead, Sasuke had killed him. That was the other wound the Alliance carried, the one that complicated everything. Sasuke Uchiha had gotten what he said he wanted, had looked his brother in the face at the end and taken everything from him, and what he found on the other side of that was not the closure he had built his life around. It was a truth so large it had broken something in him that vengeance had been holding together. He knew now what Itachi had been. He knew what had been done to the Uchiha clan, and by whom, and the fury that lived in him had found a new address. He had not come back to Konoha. He had found the masked man instead. Sakura had tried to reach him. 3 times she had tracked him down through channels that cost her more than she talked about, and 3 times she had stood in front of him and said things she had rehearsed alone in the dark. And 3 times Sasuke had looked at her with eyes that remembered her and decided she was not worth the effort of saving. The last time, he had tried to kill her, and it was Kakashi who arrived with seconds to spare, who pulled her out of the way of something that would have ended her, and who stood there afterward with his hands shaking in a way he could not entirely stop. Sasuke served the masked man now, and he served him fully, and if you wanted to understand why, you had to understand what the masked man had offered him. The masked man wanted the infinite Tsukuyomi. He had said as much to Sasuke in private, in a moment that was either extraordinary trust or extraordinary confidence that it did not matter. He wanted to trap the world in a dream from which it would never wake, a shared illusion so total that the suffering of reality would simply cease to be relevant. And in that dream, everyone would be alive, every war would be unwaged, every death would be undone, Itachi would be alive, the Uchiha clan would be alive, a boy from Konoha would still be out there somewhere in the orange, making promises he was too stupid to know he couldn't keep. Sasuke had listened to all of it, and he had agreed, not because he believed the masked man was good, but because the dream the man described was the only future Sasuke could find worth existing in. He was not naive about what he was doing. He knew exactly what he had chosen. He simply did not care about any of the alternatives. He was also the only person alive who knew the masked man's face. The mask had come off once, in the dark, in a gesture that said more about the masked man's confidence than any show of power could. Sasuke had seen the face beneath it and understood, finally, the full shape of what he had walked into. He carried that knowledge the way he carried everything else, silently, and he used it the way you use a knife you keep hidden, only when the time was exactly right. So the elemental nations stood in an uneasy, exhausted balance. The Alliance held, the Akatsuki circled, everyone waited for the Nine Tails to surface, because when it did, whoever claimed it would tip the scales in a direction that could not be corrected. The Alliance knew this, the Masked Man knew this, Pain knew this, or at least the version of it that the Masked Man had allowed him to know. The world held its breath, and then the ocean moved. It happened at dawn, on a morning that had been ordinary until it wasn't. The sensors felt it first, shinobi stationed at coastal outposts along the elemental nation's eastern shores, men and women trained to read the world through its chakra, and what they felt made several of them question their own training. A pressure from beneath the water, not a wave, not a storm system, not anything that corresponded to weather or current or the natural behavior of the sea. Something rising. The water off the eastern coast began to change color, to churn. Great columns of it displaced upward as something below the surface pushed against the weight of the ocean with a force that should not have existed, and the coastline trembled, not violently, but enough for people miles inland to stop what they were doing and look toward the water. What rose from the sea was not a creature. It was a landmass, structures, architecture, buildings and towers and walls that had no business being at the bottom of the ocean, surfacing from the deep the way a memory surfaces, all at once and without warning, shedding seawater in cascades that caught the dawn light and turned it into something that looked, to everyone watching from the shore, like a nation announcing itself to a world that had no idea it existed. The shockwave it sent through the earth was felt from the coast to the inland villages. Not a shockwave of destruction, but of pure, impossibly dense chakra, radiating outward from the risen landmass in a pulse that every sensor in the elemental nations felt simultaneously. A wave that passed through walls and mountains and the bodies of shinobi alike and left behind it a single, wordless certainty. Something was here. Something had always been here. And now it wanted to be known. The landmass did not stop rising until it was done. That was the only way to describe it. It rose the way something rises when it has been waiting long enough, completely, without hesitation, without apology, until the last of the seawater cascaded off its edges and the morning sun found surfaces that had not seen light in longer than anyone watching could calculate. What had been open ocean was open ocean no longer. The land that surfaced swallowed the surrounding water the way a continent claims its coast, and when the displacement settled, when the waves that had sent coastal shinobi sprinting for high ground finally pulled back, the elemental nations found themselves staring at something larger than the land of water. Larger than Kirigakir and everything that surrounded it. A nation, whole and standing, built by hands that should not have existed. The seals that had held it beneath the surface were ancient in a way that made the scholars who eventually studied them go quiet. Not old in the way that crumbling ruins are old in the way that foundational things are old, designed not to deteriorate but to endure, pressed into the stone and the deep water architecture of the place by people who had understood funjutsu at a level that should not have been possible. Thousands upon thousands of feet of ocean had pressed down on those seals for decades, and they had not moved. They had not cracked. They had simply held, patient as bedrock, waiting for the moment they were told to release. The scouts arrived before the dust had finished settling. They came in boats, dozens of them launched from the coastal outposts of every major village within range, carrying shinobi whose hands never strayed far from their weapons. They approached the new landmass the way you approach something you cannot categorize, slowly, with your eyes open for anything that might tell you how afraid to be. What they found at the shoreline were figures watching them from above, standing along the elevated edges of the risen land with a stillness that made it clear they had seen the boats coming long before the boats had seen them. The figures were dressed in nothing the elemental nations recognized. The designs were precise, functional, layered in a way that suggested a culture that had been refining its craft in isolation for a very long time. The colors were deep, the materials unfamiliar, and every one of them carried themselves with the ease of people who had never once doubted that they belonged where they were standing. But they did not attack. The scouts maneuvered their boats along the perimeter for an hour, reading the shoreline, reading the figures watching them, calculating distances and sightlines and the logistics of whatever this was going to become. And then, without warning or ceremony, a smaller group of the figures descended to the waterline, stepped into their own boats, and rowed toward the scouts with their hands visible and their weapons sheathed. They carried a message. Naruto Uzumaki, holder of the Nine Tails, requested an audience with the leaders of the elemental nations. The first reaction, in every war room and every cage office that received this message, was silence. The second reaction was the particular kind of controlled alarm that leaders allowed themselves in private. The name Naruto Uzumaki had not been spoken in a present tense in 10 years. It had existed in the past tense, in memorials and in the careful grief of people who had loved him, in the hollow space where a Jinchuriki should have been and wasn't. Hearing it attached to a living request felt like being handed something that should not exist. The third reaction was suspicion. The Akatsuki still needed the 9 tails. Everyone in that room knew that a distraction of this magnitude, a risen nation, an impossible name, an invitation to gather the leaders of every major village in one place. It had the shape of a trap if you looked at it a certain way, and shinobi who had survived this long looked at everything a certain way. The masked man had already demonstrated a capacity for long planning. This could be 10 years of setup. This could be the moment the Akatsuki ended the war councils before they could coordinate a real defense. And then the scouts reported what the messengers had done. They had surrendered themselves, willingly, without conditions, without any of the careful ambiguity that characterized Akatsuki negotiations. They had placed themselves in the custody of the allied nations' shinobi with the calm of people who had nothing to hide and knew where they needed to be. Their loyalty was not to the Akatsuki. They said so plainly, and they let themselves be held as proof of it. These were not Akatsuki operatives. These were people from somewhere else entirely. The leaders agreed to meet. Their own grounds, their terms. Naruto Uzumaki could come to them, or there would be no meeting at all. Word came back from the risen nation within hours. He agreed. Sakura Haruno heard the name from Shizune, who had been given the task of informing the senior personnel, and the first thing she did was sit down. Not gracefully, she sat down the way the ground comes up to meet you when your legs decide the news is too heavy to carry standing. She had spent years building a structure inside herself to hold the fact of Naruto's death, a careful architecture of acceptance and forward motion and the daily discipline of not looking back, and in one sentence all of it had become load-bearing walls with nothing left to bear. She did not cry. She pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed, and eventually she stood back up, because that was what she did. The other rookies reacted the way people react when the ground shifts under their certainties. Kiba's first response was loud and disbelieving and then suddenly quiet in a way that was worse than the noise. Shikamaru sat with the information for a long time before he said anything, and what he eventually said was careful and analytical and did not touch the part of him that had grieved a friend, because Shikamaru had learned young that there was a time for feelings and it was not usually now. Hanana heard the news and went still in a way that people around her noticed but did not comment on, the compass needle finding north again after a decade of having nothing to point toward. Jiraiya, when he heard, asked only one question. He asked if he could be there. No one told him no. The meeting was arranged in the land of iron, neutral ground, the kind of place where the snow and the silence made posturing feel insufficient. The allied leaders arrived with their guards and their suspicions and the particular weariness of people who had been at war long enough to know that good news always costs something. Tsunade came. The Raikage came, massive and contained, his composure doing nothing to hide the fact that he was the kind of man who solved problems with his fists and considered that a reasonable approach to most situations. Gaara came, the 5th cage and the boy who had once been the most dangerous thing in the sand, carrying in his chest the hollow space where the one tail had lived until the Akatsuki took it from him. He was alive because a woman named Chiyo had looked at the body the Akatsuki had left behind after ripping Shukaku from him and decided that her remaining years were worth less than his remaining ones. She had given everything she had left to pull him back from the other side. He carried that with him the way he carried everything, quietly and without complaint, but it was there if you knew how to look. The Mizukage came, the Tsuchikage, Onoki, came with the particular gravity of a man who had seen enough of history to recognize when he was standing inside a moment that would outlast him. They were all there, in a room that had been prepared for something none of them had words for yet, when the doors opened. And Naruto Uzumaki walked in. Jiraiya saw him first. The old Sannin was standing near the back of the room with the practiced invisibility of a man who had spent his life in places he was not supposed to be, and he had the best angle, and what he saw stopped something in his chest for a full 3 seconds. The boy he remembered had been loud in his bones, loud in his posture, in the way he stood, in the orange he wore like a declaration that the world was going to look at him whether it wanted to or not. That boy had been 13 years old the last time Jiraiya had seen him, all sharp edges and unearned confidence and the peculiar invincibility of someone who had not yet learned what the world was actually capable of taking from you. What walked through that door was 23 and had learned. Naruto Uzumaki was tall now, broader in the shoulder, and every inch of him had the settled quality of someone who had finished becoming. He had not finished becoming soft. The lines of his face were harder than 13. the jaw set in a way it had not been before, and his eyes, still that particular shade of blue that people who had loved him remembered exactly, held something in their depths that had not been there a decade ago. Depth, weight, the kind of knowing that does not come from books or training but from years of carrying things in silence. He was dressed in the manner of the risen nation, layered and precise and completely unlike anything anyone in that room had seen before, and he wore it the way he wore everything, like it was his and he had decided that was enough. Walking behind him were 5 figures, his guard or his companions or both, and a single look at them told every shinobi in the room that whatever this nation had produced in 10 years, it had not been wasting its time. The first was a woman with silver white hair and pale eyes that shifted color at the edges, the unmistakable marker of the Yuki clan that Kirigakure had declared extinct in the purges. She was alive, clearly, thoroughly, dangerously alive, and the ice that moved around her as she walked was not the labored technique of someone managing a keke genkai but the casual expression of someone breathing. The Mizukage's expression changed when she saw her. It was not a comfortable change. The others were equally impossible in their own ways. A young man whose skin bore a faint metallic sheen, who moved with the deliberate precision of someone whose body was itself a weapon, the promise of a bloodline ability that none of the cage could immediately name. A woman whose hands were covered in markings that pulsed faintly, storm gray and alive in a way that suggested she and lightning had reached some kind of agreement. A man who said nothing and stood perfectly still and somehow seemed to occupy more space than his physical form accounted for, as if the air around him had decided to pay attention. And finally, a figure so young it was almost jarring in this company, whose eyes cycled through colors with each slow blink, seeing something in every direction at once. Each of them was a bloodline that had no reason to still exist. Each of them stood behind Naruto Uzumaki like a statement. Tsunade looked at him for a long time. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when everyone in them is waiting to see who speaks first and nobody wants to be wrong about the moment. It was the Reikage who broke it. He was not a man built for silence. Uzumaki, the name came out like a test. You have a great deal to explain. I know, Naruto said. His voice was different too. Still carrying that particular quality that made you feel like he was talking directly at you regardless of how many people were in the room, but steadier now. Grounded, the voice of someone who had decided exactly what he was going to say and was not afraid of any reaction to it. Tsunade sat forward. She had held herself together through the entire preparation for this meeting through the discipline of a cage who could not afford to be a grandmother in public. She held herself together now, but her eyes had not moved from him since he entered the room, and the set of her jaw was doing a great deal of work. Sit down, she said, and tell us everything. He did. He told them it began when he was 5 years old. He had thought they were ghosts at first, which was a reasonable conclusion for a 5-year-old alone in an orphanage to reach when 3 figures appeared to him that no one else could see. They looked like people, they spoke like people, but there was something about them that was between states, present without being fully present, visible without being fully real, and the young Naruto had spent several weeks deciding whether to be afraid of them before concluding that they were too interesting to be afraid of. They were not ghosts, they were Uzumakis, 3 elders, the last survivors of a clan that had been systematically destroyed during the Second Great Shinobi War, cut down by the combined military action of 3 nations who had looked at the Uzumaki's mastery of Funjutsu and their deep reserves of chakra and decided that such power needed to be eliminated before it could be unified. The nations that had done this were represented in this room. The Reikage sat very still. Onoki's expression did not change, but his hands on the table were no longer relaxed. The Mizukage said nothing, but she was not meeting Naruto's eyes. Naruto noticed. He acknowledged it with a look that was not forgiveness but was not accusation either, just recognition, just the particular acknowledgement of someone who has had a long time to sit with history and decide what to do with it. He was not here for old grudges, he told them. He said it plainly, without performance, and the plainness of it was somehow more convincing than any formal declaration would have been. The 3 elders had survived by doing something that existed at the absolute edge of what Funjutsu could accomplish. They had sealed their own essence, their consciousness and knowledge and the accumulated weight of everything they had ever learned, into a relic, a physical object that served as an anchor between them and the living world. They were not alive in the way that Naruto and everyone in this room was alive. They were not dead in the way that the dead are dead. They were something in between, sustained by the seal, diminishing slowly, aware that their time was finite and determined to use what remained of it. They had come to him because they needed an Uzumaki, and Naruto was the only one available. There had been another, he did not say who. The name was not something he was prepared to share in this room, in this company, at this particular moment in time. He simply said that the other Uzumaki had declined, and that they had come to him instead, a 5-year-old boy sitting in an orphanage in Konoha being regarded as the container of a monster, and they had decided that this child was what they had been waiting for. Tsunade's eyes narrowed. She had been a Sannin before she was a Hokage, and she had always been better at reading people than she let on. He told them about the fool. They had told him, those 3 fading elders, that in order to move through the world freely and take from it what he needed, he had to be invisible. And the most invisible thing in the world is something everyone has already decided is beneath their notice. He had been loud, he told them, and clumsy, and desperate for approval, and the orange jumpsuit had not been accidental. People who are watching a spectacle do not watch what the spectacle is watching. People who have decided you are a fool do not guard their secrets from you. Naruto had moved through Konoha for 12 years as exactly what everyone expected him to be, and in that time he had learned things that Konoha's intelligence apparatus would have protected with its life. He apologized. He said it directly to Tsunade, looking at her, and the apology had the texture of something he had been carrying for a long time and had made peace with carrying but was still glad to set down. He had taken secrets. He had passed information to the elders, who used it to make decisions about timing, about resources, about what the surface world was doing and when it would be safe to act. He had not done it to harm Konoha. That was the truth, he said, and it had the ring of the truth, that flat, undecorated quality that distinguishes it from the things people say when they want you to believe them. Tsunade was furious. She was also listening, which was its own kind of answer about what she believed. He told them about the city. The Uzumaki elders had been working towards something long before the clan's destruction, an application of funjutsu so ambitious it bordered on mythology. An underwater settlement, self-sustaining, sealed against the pressure of the deep and capable of supporting not dozens of people but thousands, tens of thousands, eventually more. The theory had existed for generations. The construction had been interrupted by the war that killed the clan. But the seals that held the location, the foundation work, the deep architecture of it had survived, waiting in the dark at the bottom of the ocean for someone with the knowledge and the will to activate it. They had gathered people first. From the second shinobi war to the third, from the edges of every conflict, they had found the ones who were tired. Missing shinobi, listed as killed in action in the records of a dozen different villages, who had looked at the world that kept demanding their bodies for its arguments and decided they were done. People from every nation, people from bloodlines that their own villages were trying to extinguish. The Yuki member standing behind Naruto had been brought to the city as a child. Her clan hunted to extinction by Kirigikuru's purges, and she had grown up in the deep with hundreds of others who had been told by the surface world that they had no right to exist. There were Senjus among them. There were Uchiha who had slipped away before the massacre could reach them, before Itachi's knight made the choice for them. There were Hyuga who had walked away from the cage-bird seal after the elders found a way to remove it, something the main branch of the Hyuga clan had maintained for generations was impossible, and which turned out to simply be a lie told by people who benefited from it being believed. Thousands of people, living, working, building, raising children, teaching what they knew, learning what others knew, creating something in the dark beneath the ocean that the surface world had no idea existed. And Naruto had become the center of it. The relic was not permanent. The elders had known this from the beginning. The seal that sustained them was degrading the way all seals degrade when they are asked to hold something beyond their design capacity, and the question was never whether it would end but when and how. They had made a choice. Rather than let their essence simply disperse when the seal finally gave, they had fused themselves into Naruto. Everything they were and everything they knew transferred into him through a process that should not have been possible and was possible only because the Uzumaki bloodline treats impossible things as a matter of patience rather than prohibition. He was 23 years old and he carried 3 lifetimes of Funjutsu mastery. 3 lifetimes of Uzumaki knowledge, their histories and techniques and the deep understanding of sealing that had made the clan feared enough to destroy. The weight of it had settled on him when he was still a child, and he had grown up shaped by it, grown into it the way a person grows into the consequences of the choices made for them before they were old enough to choose. The city had a name, Kairos. It meant the appointed time, the moment that cannot be delayed any further, the instant when the thing that has been waiting finally arrives. He had chosen it himself. Kairos had been growing for 10 years without him. He had left a clone behind when he went, not the ordinary shadow variety that popped the moment someone looked at it wrong, but a construct sealed in blood, a specialized technique that maintained its own continuity and fed information back to him across the distance. He had known everything that was happening beneath the surface even as he lived above it, and the city had known through its clone leader that he was still there, still coming back. He had left, he said, when Sasuke made his choice. Not at the Valley of the End. Before that, he had seen something in Sasuke at the end that told him the fight was not going to end the way he had planned it to, and rather than be taken or killed or used as a weapon against everything he was trying to protect, he had used a space-time seal, one of the techniques the Uzumaki elders had spent considerable effort developing, to simply not be where the expected outcome required him to be. He had let the world believe he was dead because a dead Naruto was a nine tails that no one was hunting. It was the most effective seal he had ever used, and it had cost him nothing but 10 years of being mourned by people he loved. He said this last part without flinching, but something moved behind his eyes when he said it. Jiraiya, who had not spoken since Naruto entered the room, looked at his student for a long moment. The years between them were visible in the space between where Jiraiya was standing and where Naruto stood. All the searching and the grief in the dry leads in the mornings when Jiraiya had woken up and remembered again. He did not say any yen yet. There would be time for that. There were things more pressing than reunion. Because Naruto was not finished. He told them about pain. He knew about pain. He knew that the man had the eight-tailed beast surrounding the perimeter of the land of rain. That is why this war hasn't come to an end. The great nations could not get close, and they knew this. Yes, they did. Of course they did. The leaders knew this. They had lost teams to the outer edges of that perimeter. They did not say so in terms that acknowledged the loss, but Naruto could see it in the way they received the information, in the slight tension that confirmed what he already understood. You can't reach him, Naruto said. He was not gloating. He was establishing a fact before he offered a response to it. Not the way you've been trying. The room was quiet, but you need someone who can. He looked at each of them, one at a time, without hurry, the way someone looks when they want you to understand that what they are saying is not a request. You don't trust me yet. You have every reason not to. I took 10 years and I took your secrets and I came back with a nation none of you knew existed, and I'm standing here asking you to listen to me. He paused, but the nine tails is still unsealed. Nagato doesn't have it. The Akatsuki doesn't have it. And I'm not going to let them have it. No one spoke. You need me, Naruto said, and I need you to listen. He let the silence sit there between them, patient as a seal, waiting for the moment it was ready to release. Time skip. The reunion happened in a courtyard in the Land of Iron, in the gray morning light between the formal meetings and whatever came next, and it was nothing like the ones people had imagined over 10 years of grief. Sakura found him first. She had been holding it together since the moment she heard his name spoken in the present tense, had held it together through the meeting and the walk out in the cold air and the sound of her own footsteps, and then she turned a corner and he was there, standing with his back to her looking at the snow-capped mountains to the east, and 10 years of carefully constructed acceptance came apart in about half a second. She closed the distance and hit him. The slap cracked across the courtyard and Naruto's head turned with it, and he did not dodge it, which told her something about how much he had changed, because the 13-year-old version of him would have tried and failed and made it worse. He stood there and took it and turned back to face her, and she was already moving again, both hands gripping the front of his unfamiliar clothes, and she was saying something. Several things, none of them organized, all of them true, words that had been waiting 10 years for an address to be delivered to. He let her say them. He did not interrupt. He did not try to explain himself mid-sentence, which was also new. When she ran out of words, she put her forehead against his chest and held on, and Naruto put one hand on the back of her head and let her. I know, he said. It was 2 words and it carried everything he did not have a clean way to say. The others arrived in 1s and 2s. Iba came around the corner with Akamaru and stomped so hard his boots scraped on the stone. Lee appeared and immediately had to do something with his hands to keep them from shaking. Ino looked at Naruto for a long moment and then looked away and then looked back, as if she needed to confirm the image several times before she could trust it. Naruto moved through them the way you move through a room full of things you broke, carefully, taking responsibility for each one individually, and he said the word sorry more times in that courtyard than he had probably said it in the 10 years prior. He meant it each time, which was the thing that made it land. Shikamaru watched from the edge. He had arrived with the others, stood in the same space, watched the same reunion, and he was the only one whose expression had not moved toward relief. Shikamaru Nara was not a man who mistook his feelings for analysis, and what he was doing right now was analysis, which meant he was setting his feelings down somewhere out of the way and looking at what was actually in front of him. What was in front of him was Naruto Uzumaki, who was alive, which should have been only good news. And Shikamaru, standing there in the cold watching his old friend apologize to people who were already forgiving him, could not make it add up to only good news. Something was different, beyond the obvious, beyond the years and the bearing in the nation that had risen from the ocean. Something in the way Naruto moved through the space. Something in the eyes, which were warm when they needed to be warm and present when they needed to be present, but which, in the moments between, went somewhere that Shikamaru could not follow. He had known Naruto Uzumaki since they were children. He knew what Naruto looked like when he was being genuine and what he looked like when he was performing, and he knew what he looked like when he was both at the same time, which was the most complicated version, the one that required the most attention. Troublesome, he thought, and said nothing. Jiraiya found him last, or perhaps Naruto found Jiraiya. The old Sannin had been standing apart from the group the way he stood apart from most things, close enough to be present and far enough to maintain the fiction that he was not affected. Naruto walked to him directly, cutting through the social geometry of the courtyard with the straightforwardness of someone who had decided to stop avoiding things. Jiraiya looked at him for a long time. His student, his godson, the boy he had trained and worried about and searched for, and eventually, after years of refusing to accept it, was gone. Standing here now, 23 and built like someone had taken the boy Jiraiya remembered and put him through a decade of furnaces. "You let me think you were dead," Jiraiya said. His voice was level in a specific way that means someone is working hard to keep it level. "Yes, for 10 years. Yes." Something moved through the old man's expression, something that passed through anger and grief and the complicated love of a teacher who has watched a student become something beyond what was taught. He breathed out slowly through his nose. "We're going to talk about this," Jiraiya said. "Properly, all of it. After," Naruto said, "I promise." The word promise landed the way it always had between them, with weight, with history, with the understanding that this particular person had never said it lightly. Jiraiya looked at him for one more moment and then nodded, once, and that was the conversation for now. What came next was the demonstration. Naruto had asked for open ground, and they gave him a field outside the fortress walls where the snow had been flattened by wind into a hard white plain. The cage came, their guards, the rookies, everyone who had gathered for this impossible meeting, and they stood at the perimeter and waited to see what Naruto Uzumaki had become in 10 years underwater. He stood in the center of the field alone. And then he was not alone. The nine tails arrived the way force of nature arrives, with a sound that preceded it and a pressure that followed in the immediate physical understanding that the scale of things had changed. 9 tails of concentrated chakra spread across the sky above the field, and the creature that owned them looked down at the assembled shinobi of the elemental nations with eyes that had seen the beginning of things, and the assembled shinobi looked back up with expressions ranging from trained composure to open terror. Naruto looked up at it. "Kurama," he said. The 9 tails turned its massive head toward him. The relationship between them was visible in that single movement, not the strained coexistence of a Jinchuriki managing a prisoner, not the desperate borrowing of a shinobi taking what he could before the seal pushed back. Something that had been negotiated over 10 years in the dark, through honesty and time and the particular intimacy of two beings sealed into each other long enough to stop pretending they were separate. Kurama regarded Naruto with a recognition of something that has been genuinely known. And that recognition was more frightening to every shinobi watching than the tails or the chakra or the scale of it. The 9 tails knew its name because Naruto had taken the time to learn it. That was all. That was everything. Then came the others. They came from the edges of the field and from the air above it and from somewhere that did not correspond to any visible point of origin. The artificial tailed beasts, constructs of chakra and fuinjutsu and 10 years of kairos pushing the edges of what sealing could accomplish. They were not natural, and they were not trying to appear natural. They were designed, each one different, each one enormous, each one radiating the particular quality of something built by people who had studied the originals long enough to understand what made them dangerous and then made deliberate choices about which of those qualities to replicate and amplify. The field held a gathering of world leaders and it went absolutely silent. Shikamaru looked at the artificial beasts. He looked at Naruto standing at the center of all of it, calm as still water, and he thought, this is not enough. What he meant was, this is more than enough, and that is the problem I cannot name yet. Naruto told them what he intended to do. He was going to the land of rain. He was going to end it. They could bring their forces to the border and watch, or they could stay where they were. But the tailed beast problem and the pain problem were going to be resolved before the week was out, and he did not require their permission to resolve them. He was informing them as a courtesy, and because he needed them to understand that when he came back from the land of rain, the War Council was going to need to have some very different conversations than the ones it had been having. The Reikage started to say something about sovereignty and coordination and the chain of command that the Allied forces had established. Naruto looked at him with those blue eyes that had something ancient living behind them, and the Reikage, who was not a man who stopped for many things, stopped. The land of rain, Naruto said, by morning. He went with his five, his inner circle, the ones who had been beside him long enough that the space between them had the quality of something load-bearing. The Yuki woman, whose name was Saya, moved like cold given direction. The metal-skinned man, Tetsuya, said almost nothing and needed to say almost nothing because his presence communicated everything relevant. The storm-handed woman, Arashi, crackled faintly at the edges when she was thinking hard about something. The still man, Heisha, occupied his portion of the world with the intensity of a black hole that had decided to be polite about it. The young one with cycling eyes, Mira, saw in every direction at once and reported what she saw in a murmur that Naruto caught without appearing to listen. They crossed into rain territory at dawn. The first wave of Pain's bodies found them within minutes, and Naruto did not slow down for them. The natural energy moved through him the way water moves through an open hand, effortlessly, in quantities that should not have been possible for a moving target, because one of the things the Uzumaki elders had contributed when they fused themselves into him was a complete reimagining of how Sage Mode worked and how long it could be sustained. What came out of Naruto when he stopped holding it back was not any one technique. It was the atmosphere being rearranged. Lightning came down, not summoned lightning, not the shaped and directed technique of a shinobi drawing on a nature affinity, but actual lightning. Atmospheric discharge called and guided by a fusion of sage chakra and natural energy so dense it bent the weather around him. It came down in columns, in sheets, in precise single strikes that followed intention with a fidelity that the elemental nation's most accomplished storm release users had spent their careers chasing and never caught. And crucially, it came down in a form that Nagado's Prita path, that chakra-absorbing wall against which every elemental technique broke harmlessly, could not process, because what Naruto was channeling was not chakra shaped into lightning. It was lightning shaped by chakra, nature itself as a medium, and the distinction destroyed the Prita path's fundamental premise. The village of Rain had built its legend on the rain. The rain fell here differently than it fell anywhere else, summoned and controlled by Nagado's reach, and the bodies of Pain moved through it like extensions of his will because the rain itself was his sensory network. He felt everything it touched. He felt Naruto coming. Nagato had not stood in years before the Akatsuki's collection of the tailed beasts gave him the power to change that. He stood now on a platform above the rain-slicked rooftops of Imegakure, fully upright, the restored use of his legs a reminder of what the rinnegan could accomplish when it had enough fuel to work with, and he watched the Nine Tails chakra approaching through his rein and he felt something that he allowed himself to recognize his satisfaction. The Nine Tails had come to him. After 10 years of absence, the last piece had walked into his hands. He watched Naruto emerge from the rain at the far end of the approach and thought, finally. "Thank you," Nagato said, his voice carrying across the distance, "for bringing the Nine Tails here." Naruto looked up at him. Something in his expression was quiet, the way things are quiet before they become very loud. "The Uzumakis came to you," Naruto said. "I know they did." Nagato's expression shifted. "They told you there was another way." Naruto's voice carried no accusation, just the flat weight of a fact being laid on a table. "You should have listened. You could have been part of the answer." "That dream," Nagato said, and his voice was not cruel but it was absolute, was the dream of people who had never understood what peace actually costs. Suffering cannot be ended by hope. It can only be ended by force so complete that the capacity for causing it is removed. "I know that's what you believe," Naruto said. "I'm going to show you something else." He moved. What followed was not a fight in any ordinary sense of the word. Nagato had the rinnegan and the power of 8 captured tailed beasts behind it, and that combination had made him the closest thing to an invincible object the elemental nations had ever produced. He pulled gravity, he pushed souls, he summoned and absorbed and cycled through the 6 paths of his ability with the fluid mastery of someone who had spent years making them reflective. Any one of those abilities should have ended the engagement in seconds. Naruto knew every one of them. He knew them the way you know things that have been explained to you by people who spent their lifetimes studying them. The Uzumaki elders who had cataloged everything they could learn about the rinnegan because the rinnegan was the most dangerous thing in the world and the Uzumakis had always believed that knowledge of danger was the first condition of surviving it. He moved through the Diva Path's repulsion like he had been told exactly how much force to meet it with, because he had been. He stepped around the pool of the Asura Path's additions because he knew what they looked like before they deployed. The Naraka Path opened its King of Hell and Naruto was already somewhere else. Nagato's expression changed. It changed from satisfaction to calculation to something that was, underneath all the philosophy and the decades of accumulated pain, genuine surprise. Naruto was not just countering him. He was countering him while holding back. That was the thing that crept into Nagato's assessment as the seconds stretched and every technique failed to land cleanly, the growing understanding that the young man he was fighting was not at his ceiling. He was somewhere well below it, moving at a pace that matched Nagato without requiring Naruto's full extension, the way a patient teacher demonstrates a lesson at a speed the student can follow. The lightning came back, but differently now. Naruto brought his hands together and nature energy flooded outward from him in a wave that flattened the rain and turned the air white and called down from the sky something that was not a technique with a name. It was a claim. The heavens opened along a seam that ran from directly above Naruto to directly above Nagato, and what came through that seam was not one bolt but a sustained cascade, continuous atmospheric discharge guided by sage intent, burning through Nagato absorption ability the way water burns through nothing. Because it was not chakra to be absorbed, it was the world expressing something at Naruto's direction. Nagato himself, channeling the last of his reserves, rose to his full height on his restored legs and pushed every path technique he had left into one simultaneous assault, and Naruto walked through it. Not unscathed, not without cost, but through it, and when he came out the other side he was still standing and Nagato was not. Naruto stood over him. Konan came from the air above in a storm of paper, and from behind Naruto his five moved, Saya crystallizing the air around Konan's paper into a geometric seal structure that stopped her mid-flight and held. Arashi's storm hands pressing the seal closed with a crack of contained electricity. Konan hung suspended, unharmed, contained, looking at the man on the ground with an expression that had no name for what it was watching. Nagato lay on the wet stone of a megacure and looked up at the gray rain sky and breathed. Naruto raised his hand. The space opened, not a technique, a door. The masked man arrived through it the way he always arrived, wearing his spiral face and the confidence of someone who had been 5 steps ahead of everyone for 30 years. And he took in the scene in the rain-soaked plaza. Nagato on the ground, his body scattered. 8-tailed beasts no longer under their subjugation, and something in the body language behind the mask shifted. He had not expected this. He had expected Naruto to be a complication. He had not expected Naruto to be a conclusion. "Hand him over," the masked man said. Naruto looked at him. "Obito," he said. The mask did not move. What was behind it did. Sasuke, who had come through the same space and stood 3 steps behind the masked man, went absolutely still. He was the only person alive who was supposed to know that name. He had been given that name as a proof of trust, as a seal on the agreement between them, and now it was in someone else's mouth, and the architecture of everything he had built on top of that secret developed a crack he could hear. "How?" Obito said. His voice had changed. "The Uzumaki elders knew who you were," Naruto said. "They were very thorough." A moment passed. The rain fell. "Hand him over," Obito said again. He had recovered the flatness, the command cadence, "or your people will suffer for this." Naruto considered him the way you consider a piece on a board that has just revealed its position. "Gather your forces," he said. "Do what you want. Send whatever you have. You don't understand what I have. I understand exactly what you have." Naruto's voice was not hot. It was not cold either. It was the temperature of something decided. "And when you're done, when you've used all of it and it wasn't enough, you can ask me to stop. Until then," he stepped back, "take your answer and go." Obito looked at him for one more second. Then the space opened again and they were done. And the rain of a megacure fell on a plaza of defeated bodies and one man on the ground who had built his life's work on the premise that suffering was the only honest currency the world traded in. Naruto looked down at Nagato. "You're not dead," he said. "You'll want to think about why." Nagato woke in a cell. Clean, dry, not cruel. The walls were made of something there was not any stone he recognized, and the seal on the door was not anything the Land of Rain's archives contained. And the chakra in his body was present but restrained, not stripped but bound, held in a careful lattice that kept the rinnegan from reaching the full depth of its power. He sat up slowly and took inventory of himself and then sat with what he found. Naruto appeared at the cell door, not through it, through a speaking grate, looking in at him with those eyes that held the accumulated weight of 3 dead Uzumakis and 10 years of preparation and something else underneath that, something patient and absolute. "The world believes you're dead," Naruto said. "The Land of Rain is being processed." Your shinobi are being detained, not killed. It will be resolved. Nagato looked at him. You won, he said. What does that mean, coming from you? Naruto looked back at him for a moment. It means what it means, he said. Get some rest. Then he left, and Nagato sat in the cell that was clean and dry and not cruel and thought about the difference between those things, and what it meant that someone had bothered to make it any of them. Obito moved fast. He had been moving toward this contingency for years. The way he moved toward all contingencies, quietly and with the understanding that preparation was the only form of certainty the world permitted. The White Zetsu network was vast, grown from the same primordial mass that had kept Obito alive when the rock fell on him, multiplied and distributed over decades of patience. Tens of thousands of them, coordinated through the network, able to replace shinobi and infiltrate armies and fight in numbers that individual skill could not easily account for. And Kabuto, Yukushi Kabuto, who had taken Orochimaru's work and kept walking, who had learned to perform Edo Tensei at a scale that no previous practitioner had thought to attempt, who could call the dead back in quantities that turned the calculus of any battlefield from a question of living strength to a question of how many times a thing could die before it stayed dead. Obito launched his war 3 days after a megacure. He launched it the way someone launches something they have been holding for a long time, with all of it at once, the Zetsu flooding through the elemental nations and the reanimated dead rising on every front simultaneously. And the world did not so much go to war as discover it was already in one. The allied shinobi fought. They fought the way people fight when the dead keep getting back up and the enemy has no face and the front lines are everywhere at once. Gaara's sand moved across desert terrain, driving back Zetsu by the hundreds. The Raikage hit things with his hands until the things stopped requiring hitting and then found more things. Kakashi, who had never needed the world to be fair, adapted to the impossible conditions with the economy of movement that came from a career of surviving situations he was not supposed to survive. Naruto was everywhere, not in the sense of omnipresence but in the way of someone who had 10 years of preparation and no attachment to being only one place at a time. His clone techniques had evolved past any limit the original Naruto had known, and the artificial tailed beasts moved across the battlefields like mobile disaster, coordinated through the ceiling network he had built for exactly this purpose. The Zetsu died in numbers that made the dying feel almost administrative. Kabuto's reanimated dead returned to the ground they had come from when Naruto's 10 elite warriors found him in a way that suggested finding Kabuto had been a project with a specific completion date, not an emergency improvisation. They were the best of Kairos, 10 people drawn from every bloodline and every tradition that the underwater nation had collected and refined over decades, and they moved through Kabuto's defenses with the synchronized efficiency of people who had trained together long enough to think in each other's cadences. Kabuto fell, the Edo Tensei fell with him, every reanimated body releasing in sequence, the dead returning to their rest in a wave that moved across the battlefield and left behind it only the living and the Zetsu. The Zetsu, Naruto had already prepared for. One of them, captured and sealed and studied, gave him everything he needed. The network connected them all. He used it. What 50,000 Zetsu become when the thing connecting them is turned against them is not a battle. It is a termination. The war, which had felt like it might become the war to end all wars in the worst sense of the phrase, was over in days. No one could believe it. The allied shinobi stood on battlefields that had been transformed in the time it took to understand what was happening. And the silence that followed the end of the Zetsu and the Edo Tensei was the silence of people who had braced for a long terrible thing and found it simply over. They looked at each other. They looked at the clean battlefields. They looked toward the horizon where Kairos loomed, and they understood that they were alive because someone had decided they should be. The relief lasted about 6 hours. It ended when the artificial tailed beasts turned, not on the shinobi they had been fighting beside, on the settlements, on the villages and the outposts and the supply lines and the carefully maintained infrastructure of the elemental nations that had survived the war intact. They moved across the landscape with the coordinated efficiency of something that had been waiting for an order, and the order had clearly come, because there was nothing random about what they were destroying. It was systematic, comprehensive, the work of something that had a plan for what the map was supposed to look like when it was finished. Naruto's own people moved with them. The Kairos warriors who had fought beside the allied shinobi on the battlefields were still fighting, but the geometry had changed. They were not fighting the enemy anymore. They were managing the perimeter of what was happening, corralling the retreat of surviving shinobi, collecting the injured with an efficiency that was not gentle and was not cruel, just thorough. They were taking people, by the thousands. The cage understood what they were seeing before they could put words to it. the understanding arriving as a physical sensation before it became thought. The war was over because Naruto had ended it. The world that had existed during the war was ending because Naruto was ending that too. In a war room that had survived the Zetsu assault, the allied leaders looked at their communication lines going dark one by one and did not speak for a long time. Nagato was moved from his cell to a room with a window. The window looked out over a sealed observation platform, and from that platform he could see what Naruto had built in 10 years below the ocean and what it was doing to the world it had risen into. He watched the artificial-tailed beasts move across the landscape in the distance. He watched the organized intake of tens of thousands of survivors into Kairos' processing structures. He watched the systematic erasure of the old geography with the expression of a man who had spent his entire life trying to change the world by force and was now watching someone do it with a thoroughness that made his own methods look tentative. Naruto appeared beside him. He had the eyes he always had, blue and present and carrying that depth that had not been there at 13. He stood at the window and looked out at what he had done and made, and his expression was not troubled by it. "You came to end the war," Nagato said. "Yes, you came for more than that." Naruto did not answer immediately. Below, through the glass, one of the artificial-tailed beasts cleared a ridgeline and the landscape behind it was changed. "The war never ends," Naruto said. "You know that. You built your whole life on knowing that. One war ends, the next one starts, and the people who paid for the first one pay for the second one because the thing that creates wars is still there and no one has the nerve to remove it." Nagato looked at him. "You mean the nations? I mean everything that keeps them separate and scared and pointing at each other." Naruto's voice was level, informational, the voice of someone explaining a decision they made a long time ago. "You tried to show them pain so complete they'd stop. I tried something else." The Nine Tails chakra gathered below them, visible even through the sealed walls, a column of orange-red that lit the horizon like a false dawn. Naruto raised his hand. The tailed beast bomb that formed above the last remaining land platform of the old world was not a technique that had a precedent. It was what happened when the Nine Tails' chakra was run through a Funjutsu lattice designed by 3 lifetimes of Uzumaki mastery and amplified by the artificial beasts feeding their energy into the same structure. It was not large in the way that things that are merely big are large. It was the kind of large that exists in a separate category, the kind that changes the scale of the conversation permanently. When it dropped, the shockwave reached Kairos' barriers and stopped there. Beyond the barriers, it did not stop. The land that had been the center of the old world's conflicts, the platform on which 5 generations of shinobi had fought their parents' wars and their children's wars and wars with no names that nobody would remember, became something else. Not ruins, not rubble, a flatness that the sea was already moving to reclaim. Nagato stood at the window. He was a man who had detonated a god body over Konoha to make a point about suffering. He had looked at mass death before and called it necessary. But what he was looking at through this window was not a statement. It was a policy. The difference sat in his stomach like a stone. "You're going to call this peace," Nagato said. "I'm going to build it," Naruto said. "Whether you call it peace is up to you. You're a madman." Naruto turned from the window and looked at him. The eyes were still those eyes, still carried in them the boy who had wanted to be Hokage and the teenager who had chased a friend and the child who had sat in an orphanage talking to 3 people who were not quite alive. And underneath all of it, through all of it, wrapped around it like a seal around a vessel, something that had grown in the dark in the deep in the decade of silence. "You have Konan," Naruto said. "She's been asking for you since last night." He left. Nagato stood at the window alone. And outside the window the sea moved into the spaces where the old world had been, and Kairos rose from it like something that had always been there, waiting for everything else to clear away so it could finally be seen. The survivors were inside its walls, tens of thousands of them, shinobi and civilians, the injured and the stunned, people who had been on the losing side and the winning side of a war that had just been superseded by something none of them had voted for. They were being fed, they were being treated, they were not being executed or enslaved or any of the things that a conquering force in the history of the elemental nations would have done as a matter of course. They were being processed into a new nation, the only nation. On the walls above them, Naruto's council stood watching, the people who had been beside him in the deep, each one carrying the particular quality of someone who had been shaped by the same pressure into something harder and more specific than they would have been otherwise. They were not soft people. They had not survived 10 years of building a revolution underwater by being soft, and they looked down at the world they had inherited with the assessment of people deciding what to make of it. Naruto joined them on the wall. He looked out over what had been and what was being built and what would come next, and the expression on his face was not the expression of someone who had done something terrible. It was not the expression of someone who had done something glorious. It was the expression of someone who had made a decision they understood completely, including the cost of it, and had made it anyway. Below, the survivors moved through the intake structures of Kairos. Above, the appointed time had arrived, and it did not intend to be brief. Time skip. Obito Uchiha watched the world end from inside his own mind. He had retreated into the Kamui dimension the moment he understood what Naruto was building above a megacure. The moment the scale of the tailed beast bomb registered as something his physical body had no business being near. It was a tactical withdrawal. He told himself that as the light from outside the dimension bled through at the edges of his perception, that particular quality of light that has no comparison in normal experience, the light of something that is removing a problem permanently. He stayed inside longer than necessary. When he came back out, there was no land of fire. He stood in what had been the general region of the elemental nation's center and turned in a slow circle, and the horizon in every direction was the same. Flat, scorched at the edges where the blast had reached and cleared down to raw earth everywhere else. The geography he had memorized across a lifetime of moving through it like a ghost had been revised without consultation. The mountains were wrong, the forests were gone, the villages that had defined the map, Konoha with its stone faces, Suno with its walls against the desert, Kiri half swallowed always by its mist, all of it resolved into the same undifferentiated absence. He stood in it for a long time. Sasuke was gone. That was the thing that arrived last, the way the worst things always arrive after you have already processed the merely terrible. Sasuke had been in the physical world when Naruto dropped it. Sasuke had been in the physical world because Sasuke had not known to leave, had not known what was coming, and Obito had not told him because Obito had not known either. He had not believed Naruto capable of this specific thing. He had modeled Naruto as a threat, as an obstacle, as a complication requiring adjustment, but not as this. Not as someone willing to finish it all in one motion and simply begin counting whoever was left. That miscalculation had cost Sasuke everything. Obito started walking. He found the survivors inside Kairos's walls, tens of thousands of people who had been sorted and processed and integrated into the architecture of the new order with the efficiency of something that had been planned for years. He watched from a distance, behind the disguise of distance, the old habit of operating in the spaces between observed and unobserved. He watched the intake structures. He watched the guards. He watched the faces of people who had been shinobi 2 weeks ago learning what it meant to be subjects instead. He watched the ones who could not make that adjustment. It happened quickly. Someone raised their voice. Someone else reached for something they should not have reached for. The order came from somewhere Obito could not see, and the response came from somewhere he absolutely could. And what happened to the people who stepped out of line was not lengthy. Naruto had decided that the time for demonstrations was finished. The time for examples was also finished. What remained was the administration of a simple policy, clearly communicated, and the policy was that the new world did not have patience for the old world's reflexes. Obito watched a woman with pink hair say something to a Kairos guard that carried in its tone the unmistakable quality of someone who had decided that her grief was worth more than her survival. He recognized her. He had crossed paths with Team 7 enough times over the years to know Sakura Haruno by posture and voice and the particular stubbornness that had always seemed to him like the best and worst thing about her simultaneously. She was saying something about Naruto. She was using his name the way people use a name when they are appealing to a person they believe is still inside the thing they are confronting. Naruto was there before the sentence was finished. He did not explain himself. He did not offer her the acknowledgement of a response. What he gave her was the same thing he had given the old geography, a swift and complete resolution, and then he was already looking at the next thing that required his attention, because there was always a next thing and none of them were going to wait. Obito stopped watching. He retreated again into Kamui, into the gray-spun dimension where the rules were his and the geography was familiar and nothing had been erased without his permission. He sat in the non-space of it and thought about Sasuke, about the future he had promised him, about the infinite Tsukiyomi and the dream where everyone was alive and the world was different in the ways that mattered. He thought about how Naruto Uzumaki had looked at him in the plaza at a megacure. The eyes that knew his name, the voice that had said Obito with the flat certainty of someone reading from a document, not discovering something, just confirming what was already recorded. He thought about the Uzumaki elders and what they had built and what they had poured into that boy before they burned themselves out. Then he felt the seal. It arrived the way a trap arrives when you have been moving toward it for long enough without knowing, all at once and from every direction simultaneously. The Kamui dimension, which had been his private universe, his one inviolable retreat, suddenly had walls it had not had before. Walls that were not spatial but fundamental, funjutsu layered into the fabric of the dimension itself, pressed into its geometry the way the underwater seals had been pressed into stone, patient and invisible until the moment they were meant to be felt. He could not leave. He tried 3 times with the particular desperation of someone discovering that the ground is not where they believed it was, and each time the seal held, and each time the walls were exactly where they had been before he tried. He stood in the center of his own dimension and understood that someone had rewritten it around him while he was using it, that the space he had believed was unconditionally his had been studied and mapped and sealed by hands that knew what they were doing. When the door opened, it was Naruto's door. He came through it the way he went everywhere now, without announcement, without theater. He looked at Obito in the contained dimension with the expression of someone completing a task that had been on a list for a while. I have been studying space-time ninjutsu for a long while now. I've learned the ins and outs. I've learned how to subjugate a space that is not mine. While yours is not the first, it will not be the last. Yours is smaller compared to the others that I've already subjugated, but it is no less impressive. It was just to find the frequency that you were using, and when you arrive at the land of rain to find Nagato, it was that moment I cataloged your frequency. Now this world is mine, said Naruto. He took the mask. Not with ceremony, he picked it up from where it had been sitting on the non-floor of the dimension and looked at it for a moment, the spiral face that had moved through the history of the elemental nations for decades like a ghost of itself, directing and manipulating and building toward a dream that was now academic. Then he left, and the door sealed behind him, and Obito stood alone in the dimension that had been his sanctuary and was now his cell, and the seal in the walls did not flicker. Naruto found Nagato where he had left him, in the room with the window. Nagato had not moved much. He was a man processing things at a depth that required stillness, sitting with what he could see through the glass and what it meant that he was alive to see it. Konan was beside him, her hand on his, her presence the one thing in the new arrangement that was unambiguously his. Naruto dropped the spiral mask on the floor at Nagato's feet. It landed with a sound that was smaller than it deserved. Nagato looked at it for a moment and then looked up. Outside the window, Kairos was lit against the dark, the only light source on a horizon that had nothing else left to offer. Thousands of people moved inside its walls in the organized pattern of a society learning its new shape. Beyond those walls, the world that had contained millions of people contained thousands now, and the sea was still moving into the places where the land had been, patient and thorough, the way water is when it has been given time. Utopia, Naruto said. He said it the way you state a coordinate. The way you name a destination you have arrived at after a long journey and do not need to be sentimental about. There is nothing left, Nagato said. There is exactly enough. Naruto looked out the window at his nation, at the survivors becoming subjects, at the only light still burning on the face of the earth. Everything that was there before was in the way. Every village, every grudge, every war waiting to start because the last one hadn't finished teaching its lesson. All of it in the way. His voice did not change its temperature. Now it isn't. Nagato looked at the broken mask on the floor. He looked at the man standing at the window who had once been a boy in an orange jumpsuit screaming at a world that would not look at him. He looked at Konan beside him, alive, here, present, and he looked at the window, and beyond the window at the dark where the old world had been. Millions of people, now thousands, and a young man of 23 standing at a window calling it a beginning. This is not peace, Nagato said. His voice was not angry. He did not have the energy left for anger, and perhaps more honestly, he did not have the standing for it. He had built his life on the premise that the ends justified the suffering required to reach them. He recognized the argument, he simply did not recognize himself as the one on the other side of it. Naruto turned from the window and looked at him. No, he said, it's better than peace. Peace can be broken. He left the mask where it lay. He left the room, outside. Cyrus hummed with the sound of thousands of people learning to be one thing, and the sea moved quietly over the places where the names of nations used to be, and the appointed time held the only lights left in the world and called them enough. It called them the beginning, and there was no one left to say otherwise. The end.
So that was it, many more to come. I hope you guys enjoy each and every one of them. I'm out for now. See you guys soon. Peace.